The ring was gone. Not misplaced. Not forgotten. Gone. And standing across the great hall, bathed in firelight and wearing Marin's wedding ring like a trophy, was the woman who'd taken everything else. Her husband's attention, her place at his table, her voice in his ear. Celine's fingers sparkled as she raised her wine glass, the gold band catching every eye in the room. The nobles fell silent. Duke Corvin said nothing, and in that silence Marin understood. This wasn't about jewelry, this was an execution. But here's the thing about executions. They only work if the condemned stays still. Stick around. You're about to watch a duchess dismantle a kingdom to save it. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. You won't want to miss what happens when a woman everyone underestimated decides to stop playing defense. The coastal wind had teeth. It carved through the stone corridors of Ravenmoor Keep, the way it carved through ships' sails, relentless, cold, stripping away anything not lashed down tight. Marin had learned to walk against it years ago, learned to keep her spine straight and her skirts from billowing, learned that weakness here wasn't just seen, it was catalogued. The nobles of this duchy watched each other the way sailors watch the horizon, constantly, looking for the storm before it hit. She should have seen this one coming. "Your Grace?" The servant's voice was barely audible over the wind screaming through the open casements. "The Duke requests your presence in the hall. The evening gathering has begun." Marin's hand stilled over her jewelry box. It was walnut, inlaid with mother of pearl, a gift from her mother on her wedding day. "Keep your treasures close," her mother had said. "In a place like this, they'll take everything else." Her fingers moved automatically to where the ring should have been. The gold band with the ducal seal, the one Corvin had placed on her finger 6 years ago when she'd been young enough to mistake duty for destiny. The indentation was still there on her skin, a pale groove that hadn't faded. The ring wasn't. "Tell him I'll be down shortly," Marin said, her voice steady even as something cold bloomed in her chest. The servant hesitated. "My lady," he was insistent. Translation. Corvin was already irritated, and she was the reason. She'd been the reason for a lot of his irritations lately. Not pretty enough? Not compliant enough? Not pregnant enough? The list grew longer every season, particularly since Celine had arrived 8 months ago. All dark curls and strategic smiles, ostensibly to serve as lady-in-waiting, but actually to serve as something else entirely. 5 minutes, Marin said. The servant fled. Marin turned the jewelry box over, shook it, felt the panic rising like bile. She'd worn the ring yesterday. She knew she had. She remembered twisting it during the trade council meeting, that nervous habit she couldn't break. Remembered the weight of it when she'd washed her hands before bed. Remembered. Actually, she couldn't remember taking it off. The cold in her chest spread outward, prickling across her skin. She'd been tired last night. Bone tired. There'd been wine at dinner, more than usual. Celine had made some joke about celebrating the autumn harvest, and everyone had laughed, and Marin had drunk because the alternative was screaming. She'd come back to her chambers alone. Corvin had stopped visiting 3 months ago, dismissed her ladies, and collapsed into bed still half-dressed. Could she have lost it? Dropped it somewhere between the hall and here? No. She twisted things when she was nervous, not careless. The ring was never loose. Marin closed the jewelry box with a snap that echoed like a trap springing shut. Downstairs, the great hall blazed with light and noise. Torches lined the stone walls, their smoke curling toward the vaulted ceiling like dark prayers. The nobles had gathered in their usual clusters, the shipping families near the western hearth, the landholders by the eastern windows, the military commanders in the center where they could watch everyone else. Servants moved through the crowd with wine and roasted meats, the smell of rosemary and smoke thick enough to taste. And there, beside the Duke's chair, stood Celine. She wore midnight blue, a color that made her skin look like cream and her eyes look like promises. Her hair was pinned up with silver combs, exposing the elegant line of her neck. She was laughing at something Baron Thale had said, her head tilted just so, one hand resting on the back of Corvin's chair in a gesture so casually possessive it made Marin's teeth ache. The other hand held a wine glass. On her finger, catching the torchlight like a small sun, was Marin's ring. The hall didn't go silent all at once. It was more like a wave, conversation dying in sections as people noticed where Marin was looking, then noticed what she was looking at, then noticed the complete absence of that same ring on Marin's own hand. The realization moved through the crowd like fire through dry timber. Lady Ashford's eyes went wide. Lord Crane's mouth fell open. Even the servants stopped moving, platters frozen in midair. Celine looked up and met Marin's gaze across the hall. She smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, which somehow made it worse. It was confident, almost gentle, the smile of someone who'd already won and could afford to be gracious about it. She lifted her wine glass slightly, a toast, a greeting, and the ring flashed again, unmistakable. Marin's heart was doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm that felt like hoofbeats on cobblestones, fast and panicked and loud. Every instinct screamed at her to cross the hall, to rip the ring off Celine's finger, to demand an explanation, to make a scene that would at least prove she wasn't complicit in this humiliation. But that's what Celine wanted. Marin could see it in the slight tension around her eyes, the way she'd positioned herself in the center of the room with maximum visibility. This was theater. Marin was supposed to react, to scream, to cry, to make herself small and hysterical, while Celine remained poised and perfect. So Marin didn't move. She stood in the doorway and looked at Celine the way she'd learned to look at storms from the castle ramparts, assessing trajectory, calculating damage, planning survival. 3 heartbeats. 5. Long enough for the silence to stretch from shocked to uncomfortable. Then she walked to the wine table, poured herself a glass with hands that didn't shake, and joined the shipping families by the western hearth. The conversation around her stumbled back to life like a cart with a broken wheel, jerky, uncertain, everyone trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed whatever the hell that was. "Duchess," Lord Pembroke said, too loudly, "we were just discussing the new tariffs from the eastern ports. Outrageous, really. They're trying to strangle our trade routes." "Are they?" Marin said. Her voice came out normal. She was distantly proud of that. "Absolutely. Baron Thaley thinks we should retaliate by—" "Where's the Duke?" Marin interrupted. Pembroke blinked. "I believe he's speaking with Commander Frost about the garrison rotations." Translation. Corvin had seen the ring on Celine's finger and decided the most important thing he could do right now was be literally anywhere else. Coward. Marin sipped her wine. It tasted like copper and ashes. Across the hall, Celine was holding court near the Duke's empty chair, a little cluster of younger nobles gathering around her like moths around a flame. She was telling some story, her hands moving gracefully, the ring catching light with every gesture. "How did you get it?" That was the question burning through Marin's skull. She'd been alone in her chambers. The doors had been locked. Her ladies-in-waiting were loyal, or at least she'd thought they were. Had someone been bribed, threatened, or had she actually been careless enough to lose it? No, that didn't track. Marin might be many things, too serious, too focused, too unwilling to simper and scheme, but she wasn't careless, not about the symbols that kept her safe. "Duchess?" Marin turned. Lady Ashford had materialized at her elbow, her round face creased with concern. She was one of the few genuinely kind people in this viper's nest, which meant she was also one of the least powerful. "I'm fine, Catherine," Marin said. "You're clearly not." Ashford's voice dropped to a whisper. "Everyone's talking. They're saying—" "I know what they're saying." "Did you give her the ring?" The question was so absurd Marin almost laughed. "Of course not. Then how—" "I don't know." Marin kept her eyes on Celine, who was now laughing at something Baron Thale had said, her hand resting on his arm in that way she had, like every touch was a gift. "But I'm going to find out." Ashford bit her lip. "Marin, be careful. If she took it, she's not going to admit it. And if you accuse her publicly without proof—" She didn't need to finish. Marin knew the calculus. Accuse Celine of theft, and it became a question of credibility. A jealous wife versus a charming mistress. Everyone already knew Corvin preferred Celine's company. Half the court probably assumed Marin had discarded the ring in some fit of spite. The silence from the Duke's corner was already damning enough. "I'm not going to accuse her," Marin said quietly. "Then what? I'm going to wait." Because here's what everyone seemed to forget about Marin. She'd been raised in the Northern Territories, where winter lasted 8 months, and patience was the difference between survival and starvation. You didn't fight the cold by screaming at it. You banked your fires, rationed your supplies, and waited for the moment when your enemy made a mistake. Celine had made her opening move. Marin just needed to figure out what the game actually was. The evening dragged on with the momentum of a funeral procession. Marin stayed by the hearth, making small talk with the shipping families, discussing cargo manifests and weather patterns, and the rising cost of sailcloth, with the same focus she'd given to council meetings when people still pretended her opinion mattered. She didn't look at Celine again. Didn't look at the empty space where Corvin should have been sitting. Didn't let her face show anything except mild interest in Lord Pembroke's complaints about pirates. But she listened. Conversations had layers in Ravenmoor Keep. The surface was always safe: trade, weather, harvests. But underneath, if you paid attention, you could hear the real currents. Who was aligning with whom, where the power was shifting, what people were afraid to say out loud. Tonight, the current was running one direction, away from Marin. Can't blame him, really. 6 years and no heir. She's always been cold. At least Celine makes him smile. The words drifted past like poisoned smoke. Marin kept her expression neutral, her posture straight, her wine glass exactly 3/4 full. She'd learned this from her mother, too. People would forgive you for almost anything except appearing weak. Around midnight, Corvin finally made an appearance. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes, his dark hair disheveled in that way that used to make Marin want to smooth it down, but now just made her want to ask if he'd been drinking. He made a circuit of the room, clasping shoulders and laughing at jokes, playing the role of beloved duke with the ease of long practice. He didn't look at Marin, but he did stop beside Celine, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture so automatic it was worse than intentional. They stood like that for a moment, a portrait of easy intimacy, while the hall watched and drew its own conclusions. Then Corvin said something too quiet for Marin to hear, and Celine laughed, bright and delighted, and raised her hand to touch his cheek. The ring gleamed between them like a shared secret. Marin set down her wine glass very carefully and walked out of the hall. The corridors were blessedly empty, just her footsteps echoing off stone and the wind howling through the arrow slits. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through the familiar maze, past the armory, past the library, past the chapel she never visited anymore because prayer felt like shouting into a void. She ended up in the eastern tower, the one that overlooked the harbor. Below, the sea churned black and silver under the moonlight, ships rocking at anchor like restless horses. Ravenmoor's wealth came from those ships, trade routes that stretched from the northern ice fields to the southern spice ports, cargo that ranged from furs to grain to weapons. Marin's father had controlled half those routes before he died. Her marriage to Corvin was supposed to unite the coastal holdings, create a trading empire that could weather any storm. Instead, she'd spent 6 years watching her inheritance get absorbed into her husband's ledgers, while she got absorbed into irrelevance. "Thought I might find you here." Marin turned. Commander Helena Frost stood in the doorway, her military coat unbuttoned, her gray hair escaping its braid. She was 10 years older than Marin, scarred from 2 decades of coastal defense, and one of exactly 3 people in this keep Marin would trust with her life. "Not in the mood for company," Marin said. "Good thing I'm not company." Frost crossed to the window, her boots loud on the stone floor. "I'm a concerned associate who thinks you're about to do something stupid." "I'm not doing anything." "That's the stupid part." Frost leaned against the wall, studying Marin with the same intensity she brought to battle planning. "Celine just humiliated you in front of the entire court. The Duke did nothing, and you walked out like you were going for an evening stroll. That's not strategy, Marin. That's surrender. It's patience. It's going to get you discarded." Frost's voice was blunt. "You think I haven't seen this before? The wife falls out of favor, the mistress gets bold, and before you know it, there's an annulment and a new duchess. One who smiles more and argues less and gives the Duke what he wants." "An heir," Marin said flatly. "Among other things." Frost's expression softened slightly. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to be realistic. If you don't fight back, I am fighting back." Marin turned from the window. "Just not the way everyone expects." Frost raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Marin hesitated. She'd been turning it over in her mind all evening, the pieces clicking together like the components of a good trade route. The ring wasn't just stolen, it was displayed. Celine wanted everyone to see it, wanted everyone to think I'd either lost it or given it away. That's not about jewelry. That's about legitimacy. So why now? Why tonight? Marin started pacing, her mind working faster than her feet. Celine's been here 8 months. She's had Corvin's attention for at least 6. If she just wanted to be his mistress, she could have done that quietly. But she's not being quiet. She's making a statement. That she's replacing you. That she already has. Marin stopped. Think about it. The ring is the symbol of my marriage, my position. If I've lost it, if I'm careless enough to let it disappear, then I'm obviously unfit to hold that position. And if Celine has it instead, then she's the rightful Duchess. Frost's eyes narrowed. You think she's angling for marriage. I think someone is. Marin's mind was racing now, connections forming like trade routes on a map. Celine's not high-born enough to marry a duke on her own merits. But if I'm discredited first, if there's a scandal, if the marriage is annulled for, say, failure to produce an heir after 6 years, then Corvin would be free to marry someone more suitable. Frost let out a low whistle. That's ambitious. That's survival. Marin turned back to the window. Below, the ships rocked in their moorings, carrying cargo she'd helped negotiate, using routes she'd helped establish. 6 years of work. 6 years of making herself indispensable to the duchy's economy while making herself invisible everywhere else. Maybe that had been the mistake. So what are you going to do? Frost asked. Marin thought about her mother's advice. Keep your treasures close. But also, know when to let them go. I'm going to let her keep the ring, Marin said slowly. For now. Frost looked at her like she'd suggested burning down the keep. You're joking. I'm serious. If I demand it back, I look desperate. If I accuse her of theft, I look paranoid. But if I let her wear it, let her think she's won. Marin's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then I get to see what she does next. That's a dangerous game. I've been playing it for 6 years. Marin pushed away from the window. I'm just done playing defense. She left Frost in the tower and made her way back to her chambers. The corridors were quieter now, the evening gathering winding down, nobles drifting to their rooms or their intrigues. Marin passed Lord Crane in the hallway, and he had the grace to look embarrassed, mumbling something about pleasant dreams before scurrying away. Her chambers were cold when she entered. The fire had burned down to embers, and the wind rattled the shutters like it was trying to get in. Marin locked the door behind her, then checked it twice. Paranoid, maybe, but justified. She rebuilt the fire herself, not bothering to call for servants. The motions were soothing, kindling, larger pieces, coaxing the flames back to life. Her mother had taught her this too. Never depend on others for warmth. When the fire was crackling again, Marin sat at her desk and pulled out parchment and ink. She was done being invisible, done being patient, done waiting for Corvin to remember she existed or for the court to remember she mattered. If Celine wanted war, Marin would give her war. But not the kind anyone expected. Marin started writing, her hand steady, her mind clear. Names, resources, trade routes, every piece of Ravenmoor's economy she'd helped build and still understood better than anyone else in this keep, including her husband. The wind screamed outside, but inside the fire burned bright, and Marin worked through the night, planning her opening move. If they wanted to see what happened when you backed a duchess into a corner, they were about to find out. The first ship didn't leave port. Marin heard about it 3 days after the ring incident from Lord Pembroke himself, who cornered her in the library looking like a man who'd just watched his fortune sink into the harbor. Duchess, I need your counsel. His voice had that edge people got when they were trying very hard not to panic. The Serpent's Grace, she was supposed to sail for the northern ports yesterday morning. Full cargo hold. Premium furs, winter grain, 3 crates of Corvin steel. Marin looked up from the ledger she'd been studying. Trade manifests from the last 2 years, cross-referenced with shipping schedules and port fees. She'd been awake for most of the past 72 hours, and it showed. Her eyes felt like they'd been rolled in sand, and she'd stopped bothering with elaborate hairstyles, just a simple braid that kept falling over her shoulder. What happened? She asked. The harbor master refused to release her. Pembroke's hands twisted together. Said there were irregularities in the cargo documentation, customs seals missing, export licenses out of date. He impounded the whole damn ship until it's sorted. Were the licenses out of date? No, Pembroke caught himself. They shouldn't be. We renewed everything last quarter. Same process we've used for years. Marin set down her pen carefully. Did the harbor master say who ordered the inspection? He claimed it was routine, but routine inspections don't happen to fully loaded ships an hour before dawn departure. Someone flagged us, Duchess. Someone with enough authority to make the harbor master jump. They both knew who that someone was. Marin had called for a maritime audit 2 days ago. During a council meeting, Corvin hadn't bothered attending. Just a simple proposal. Review all shipping documentation to ensure compliance with the new Eastern port tariffs. Perfectly reasonable. Perfectly boring. The kind of administrative tedium that made most nobles' eyes glaze over. Except it had one very specific effect. It froze everything. Froze. No ship could leave without updated paperwork. No cargo could move without verified seals. And since Marin had suggested the audit, she'd volunteered to oversee it personally, which meant every trade family in Ravenmore suddenly needed her signature to conduct business. The same Duchess they'd been quietly writing off as irrelevant 3 days ago. How long until the Grace can sail? Marin asked. If I can get the paperwork sorted, 2 days? Maybe 3. Pembroke leaned forward. But Duchess, I've got contracts. Buyers waiting in the northern ports. If I'm late, they'll source from someone else, and I'll eat the loss on the entire cargo. We're talking thousands in lost revenue. I understand. Is there any way to expedite? No. Marin's voice was flat. The audit is comprehensive. Every ship gets the same treatment. No exceptions. Pembroke's face went through several interesting colors. But surely for established families, for loyal supporters of the duchy. The audit is to protect loyal supporters, Marin interrupted. Unless you'd prefer I explain to the Duke why his trade revenues are down 15% this quarter because someone's been skimming off the top? That stopped him cold. 15%? His voice cracked. That's impossible, is it? Marin pulled one of the ledgers toward her, flipped it open to a page she'd marked with red ink. This is the official record of export fees collected at Ravenmore Harbor for the summer season, and this, she pulled out a second ledger, is the unofficial record from the actual harbor master's logs. Notice anything interesting? Pembroke stared at the numbers. His face went pale. Someone's been paying reduced fees, Marin said quietly. Substantial reductions. The kind that only happen when the right person gets the right incentive to look the other way. I had nothing to do with that. I believe you, but someone did. And until I figure out who, every ship stays in port until I personally verify the documentation is clean. She met his eyes. Unless you'd like me to stop the audit? Let the skimming continue? I'm sure the Duke would understand when the treasury runs dry. Pembroke swallowed hard. No, Your Grace, the audit is necessary. Good. Get me your paperwork by tomorrow morning. I'll review it personally. He left looking like a man who'd just had his pockets turned out and wasn't sure whether to be grateful or furious. Marin waited until his footsteps faded, then allowed herself a small, tight smile. 1 ship down, 16 to go. By the end of the week, the harbor was a graveyard. Ships sat at anchor, their sails furled, their crews idle and restless. The docks, usually organized chaos, cargo being loaded and unloaded in a constant flow, were silent except for the gulls and the slap of water against hulls. No goods moving meant no fees collected. No fees meant no revenue. No revenue meant nervous nobles and angrier merchants. And all of it traced back to one person, the Duchess everyone thought had been defanged. Marin worked from dawn until well past midnight, reviewing documents in her chambers with a speed that would have impressed her tutors. She wasn't trying to be slow or obstructive. She was being thorough. Every cargo manifest, every customs seal, every export license and shipping contract and letter of credit. And what she found made her blood run cold. The skimming wasn't random, it was systematic. Certain ships, always the same families, always the same routes, got waved through with minimal fees. Others paid full price. The difference got pocketed somewhere between the harbor master's office and the ducal treasury. But it was the pattern that interested Marin. The families getting the discounts? They were all the ones who'd been most welcoming to Celine, who invited her to their dinners, who laughed at her jokes and brought her gifts and generally treated her like she was already the Duchess. Coincidence? Marin didn't believe in coincidences. She was copying another suspicious entry into her personal ledger when someone knocked on her door. Not the polite tap of a servant, 3 sharp raps that sounded like a challenge. "It's open," Marin called. The door banged inward. Celine swept in like she owned the place, midnight blue silk swishing around her ankles, that damn ring still glittering on her finger. "Duchess," her voice was honey over steel. "We need to talk." Marin set down her pen. "Do we?" "Yes." Celine closed the door behind her, not gently, and crossed to the desk. Up close, Marin could see the cracks in her perfect facade, tension around her eyes, a muscle jumping in her jaw. "Your little audit is causing problems." "It's supposed to. There are problems to be found. Trade is the lifeblood of this duchy. You're strangling it." "I'm ensuring it's not being bled dry by thieves." Marin leaned back in her chair, deliberately casual. "Unless you have some objection to honest accounting?" Celine's smile was sharp enough to cut. "I have an objection to you using administrative busywork to throw a tantrum." "A tantrum? What else would you call it? The Duke chooses someone else, and suddenly you're sabotaging the entire economy." Celine leaned forward, bracing her hands on the desk. The ring caught the candlelight, a small sun between them. "Everyone knows what this is really about, Marin. You're hurt, you're angry, and you're lashing out like a child who didn't get her way." Marin felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was the play, then. Paint her as emotional, irrational, unstable. Make the audit about jealousy instead of corruption. "Interesting theory," she said. "Here's another one. I'm doing my job. The one I've been doing for 6 years while everyone pretended not to notice. Your job is to support the Duke. My job is to protect the duchy's interests, which includes making sure its trade revenues aren't being siphoned off by whoever's clever enough to bribe the right officials." Marin pulled out the ledgers, spun them around so Celine could see. "Care to explain why the ships owned by your closest friends pay half the export fees of everyone else?" Celine's eyes flicked down to the numbers. Something moved across her face, too quick to read, but there. "I don't manage the harbor," she said. "No. But you spend a lot of time with people who benefit from its mismanagement." Marin tapped the page. "Baron Thale, Lady Verner, Lord Crane, all paying reduced fees, all suddenly very interested in cultivating your friendship. That's not coincidence, Celine. That's a network. You're inventing conspiracies because you can't accept that people prefer my company to yours." "Maybe they do. You're certainly more charming." Marin's voice was desert dry. "But charm doesn't explain how their ships get preferential treatment. That takes coordination. Planning. Someone on the inside making sure the right documents get overlooked." Celine straightened, her expression smoothing into something unreadable. "You're playing a dangerous game, Marin. So are you. The Duke won't tolerate you disrupting trade over a personal vendetta. Then he should probably attend a council meeting and say so himself." Marin met Celine's eyes. Instead of sending his mistress to fight his battles, the word hung between them like a slap. Celine's composure cracked, just for a second, just enough. Her hand flexed, the stolen ring pressing into her palm. "You're going to regret this." "Probably, but not today." Celine turned and left without another word, the door slamming hard enough to make the candles flicker. Marin sat very still until her hand stopped shaking. Then she went back to work. The council meeting happened 4 days later in the Great Hall with all the senior nobles present. Corvin actually showed up for this one, which told Marin exactly how much pressure Celine had been applying. He looked awful. Shadows under his eyes, his jaw tight, the kind of exhausted frustration that came from being pulled in multiple directions by people who all thought they knew better than him. Marin almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Duchess Marin," his voice carried across the hall, formal and cold. "I understand you've initiated a comprehensive trade audit without consulting this council." Marin stood. She'd dressed carefully for this, her mother's emerald pendant, her hair pinned up severely, every inch the Northern Duchess her father had raised. No warmth, no apology. "I did, Your Grace. The Eastern port tariffs required updated documentation, and I thought it prudent to ensure our records were in order. By halting all shipping for a week, by verifying that every ship leaving this harbor is operating legally and paying appropriate fees to the ducal treasury." She pulled out her ledgers, the real ones, not the doctored versions someone had been using. "Would you like to review the discrepancies I found, or shall I summarize for the council?" Corvin's jaw worked. Behind him, Marin could see Celine in the gallery, watching with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "Summarize," Corvin said tersely. Marin took a breath. This was it. The moment she either proved herself indispensable or painted a target on her back so large even Frost Garrison couldn't protect her. Over the past 18 months, approximately 15% of trade revenue has failed to reach the ducal treasury. The missing funds traced to reduced fees charged to specific ships, always the same families, always the same routes. The harbor master claims he was acting on orders from the Trade Council. The Trade Council claims they issued no such orders. She paused. Someone is lying, and that someone has cost this duchy roughly 40,000 gold marks. The hall erupted, nobles shouting over each other. Baron Thale red-faced in sputtering denials, Lady Werner demanding to see the evidence. Lord Pembroke looking like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Corvin raised his hand for silence. It took 3 tries. "These are serious accusations, Duchess. They're serious crimes, Your Grace." "Do you have proof?" "I have the harbor master's logs, the customs records, the shipping manifests, all cross-referenced." Marin gestured to the stack of ledgers on the table. "Any member of this council is welcome to review them." "This is absurd," Baron Thale burst out. "I've paid every fee requested of me." "Requested, not required." Marin turned to face him. "The standard export fee for a cargo hold of your size is 800 marks. You've been paying 400. Would you like to explain why?" The harbor master said," Thale floundered. "This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error." "That happens every single time your ships sail? For 18 months? Marin's voice was scalpel sharp. "Remarkable consistency for an error." Lady Werner stood, her face pale but composed. "Even if the fees were incorrectly assessed, and I'm not conceding they were, how does that translate to conspiracy? The harbor master made mistakes. Fire him and move on." "I would. Except the harbor master keeps meticulous records of every conversation about fee adjustments, including who authorized them." Marin pulled out another document. "He was told the reductions were approved by someone close to the Duke, someone with the authority to speak on his behalf regarding matters of trade and finance." Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Corvin's voice came out strangled. "Who?" Marin looked at Celine. Every eye in the hall followed. Celine stood in the gallery, her face a mask of beautiful confusion. "This is insane. I have no authority over trade policy. I'm not even on the council." "No," Marin agreed, "but you've been very influential lately, making introductions, facilitating friendships, suggesting to certain families that you could help smooth their business dealings if they were appropriately grateful." "That's a lie." "Is it?" Marin gestured to the nobles around the table. Thale, Werner, Crane, half a dozen others. "How many of you have given gifts to Lady Celine, invited her to private dinners, offered her considerations in exchange for her goodwill with the Duke?" No one spoke, but no one denied it either. Celine's composure finally shattered. "You're twisting innocent courtesy into corruption because you're jealous and bitter. Everyone in this room knows it." "What I know," Marin said, "is that trade revenue dropped the month you arrived, that certain families started paying reduced fees the week after they started courting your favor, and that the harbor master's records show someone claiming ducal authority approved every single reduction." She turned back to Corvin. "Your Grace, someone has been using your name, or at least the implication of your name, to run a protection scheme through our harbor. I want to know who." Corvin looked between Marin and Celine like a man watching 2 storms collide and realizing he was standing in the middle. "This council is adjourned," he said abruptly. "Duchess Marin, you'll continue the audit. Anyone found in violation of proper fee schedules will pay restitution plus penalty, harbor master included." He stood. "And someone get me a drink." He left before anyone could respond. The nobles scattered like startled birds, some rushing to examine Marin's ledgers, others fleeing before they could be implicated. Celine disappeared into the gallery shadows without a word. Marin gathered her documents with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, because she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Commander Frost appeared at her elbow. That was either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both. "You just accused the Duke's mistress of orchestrating a corruption scheme in front of the entire council. If you're wrong—" "I'm not wrong." Marin's voice was flat. "The evidence is there. The pattern is there. Celine's been building a power base using the duchy's resources, and everyone's been too distracted by court gossip to notice. And the ring? Marin touched her bare finger absently. Still not about the ring. It's about what wearing it means. If Celine can take my place publicly, wearing my symbol of authority, speaking with my husband's implied backing, controlling access to trade benefits, then why does the duchy need me at all? So you're exposing her network. I'm exposing the cost of her ambition. Marin looked around the rapidly emptying hall. Those families paid reduced fees because they thought Celine had the Duke's ear, but that means the duchy lost revenue. Real money. The kind of loss Corvin can't ignore even if he wants to. Frost let out a low whistle. You're making her expensive. I'm making her a liability. And if Corvin chooses her anyway, then Marin was finished. Completely. No amount of ledgers or evidence would save her from an annulment if Corvin decided Celine was worth the cost. But she didn't say that out loud. Instead, she said, then at least the treasury will be in order for whoever comes next. She left Frost in this hall and went back to her chambers, where the stack of unreviewed shipping documents waited like an accusation. She worked through dinner, through the evening watch change, through the distant sounds of the keep settling into night. Around midnight, someone knocked. Marin considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, soft, almost apologetic. She opened the door. Lady Ashford stood in the corridor, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her round face anxious in the candlelight. Catherine, it's late. I know, I'm sorry, but I thought you should know. Ashford glanced down the corridor nervously. Lady Verner is meeting with Celine right now, in the Western Tower. Marin's exhaustion evaporated. Are you sure? I saw them myself, and Baron Thaley is with them. Ashford's hands twisted in her shawl. Marin, they looked angry, scared. I think they're planning something. Of course they were. Marin had just exposed their scheme in front of the entire council. They'd either cut their losses and throw Celine to the wolves, or they'd double down and try to discredit Marin before she could dig any deeper. Thank you for telling me, Marin said. What are you going to do? Good question. Marin could confront them directly, burst into the meeting, and demand answers. But that was reactive, emotional, exactly what Celine would expect. Or she could wait. See what they decided. Give them enough rope to hang themselves. Except waiting meant risking they'd come up with something clever. The third option was the one that made her stomach clench. She could stop this entire thing right now. Apologize to Corvin, claim the audit had been overzealous, let the reduced fees slide in exchange for future compliance. Make peace with Celine. Go back to being invisible, safe, irrelevant. Marin thought about her mother, who'd spent 40 years married to a northern lord and never once bent when the winter winds came screaming, who told her daughter, you can survive anything if you're willing to pay the price. I'm going to finish the audit, Marin said. Every ship, every document, and if they try to stop me, I'll make sure everyone knows why. Ashford looked at her with something between admiration and fear. Be careful. Careful doesn't win wars, Catherine. She closed the door and went back to her desk, where the shipping manifests waited. But she didn't work on the audit. Instead, she pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and started writing a different kind of document. Not a ledger, not evidence, a contingency plan. Because if Celine's allies were meeting to plan their response, Marin needed to be 3 steps ahead when they made their move. And this time, she wasn't playing to survive. She was playing to win. The ink dried on the parchment, and outside the wind picked up, carrying the smell of salt and storms. Somewhere in the keep, Celine was spinning her next web. Corvin was probably drowning his confusion in wine. The nobles were calculating which side would cost them less. And Marin sat in her cold chambers, surrounded by evidence of corruption, wearing her mother's pendant like armor, planning the kind of move that would either save her or destroy everything she'd spent 6 years building. The ring on Celine's finger gleamed in Marin's memory. A taunt, a trophy, a declaration of war. Fine. Let them all see what happened when you gave a northern duchess a reason to fight. The storm hit 3 days later. Not the weather kind, though the coastal winds were howling hard enough to rattle shutters and send loose roof tiles crashing into courtyards. This was the political kind, the sort that started with whispers in corridors and ended with blood on the floor. Marin was in the treasury room when it began, elbow deep in documents that smelled like mildew and old ink. The treasury was technically Corvin's domain, but he hadn't set foot in here for 2 years, and the steward who was supposed to manage it had conveniently died last spring. No replacement appointed. Just another duty that had quietly fallen to Marin while everyone pretended not to notice. She'd been there since dawn, cross-referencing the harbor logs against the actual treasury deposits. The numbers weren't just wrong, they were artfully wrong. Someone had been very careful to make the books balance on the surface while hiding the real discrepancies 3 layers deep. "Your Grace," Marin looked up. One of the junior clerks stood in the doorway, a boy barely old enough to shave, his face pale. "The Duke requests your presence in the Great Hall, immediately." The way he said immediately made Marin's stomach drop. She set down the ledger carefully, brushed dust off her sleeves, and followed. The Great Hall was packed. Not just the council, everyone. Every noble family with holdings in Ravenmoor, every merchant guild representative, every ship captain currently trapped in port. They lined the walls like spectators at an execution, faces ranging from curious to hostile. Corvin sat in the ducal chair looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. Celine stood beside him, one hand resting on the chair's arm in a gesture that was probably meant to look supportive, but came across as possessive. And in the center of the hall, flanked by guards, stood Baron Thael. He looked worse than Corvin. His clothes were rumpled, his face blotchy, his hands shaking so badly he'd clasped them behind his back to hide it. Marin's pulse kicked up. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. "Duchess Marin," Corvin's voice echoed off the stone walls. "Baron Thael has brought a serious accusation to my attention, one that requires immediate resolution." Marin stopped 10 feet from the ducal chair, her mind racing through possibilities. "What accusation?" Thael's voice came out strangled. "You've been falsifying records." The hall went silent. "Excuse me?" Marin's voice was dangerously quiet. "The audit, the shipping documents. You've been altering them to make it look like I, like several families, have been paying reduced fees, but the original records tell a different story." Thael was sweating despite the cold. "You've been fabricating evidence to support a vendetta against Lady Celine." Marin felt the floor tilt under her feet. This was the countermove, the one she'd been waiting for. But she'd expected legal maneuvering, political pressure, maybe an attempt to discredit her conclusions. She hadn't expected them to accuse her of forgery. "That's a lie," she said flatly. "Is it?" Celine's voice was silk over poison. "Baron Thael has his own copies of the shipping manifests, signed and sealed by the harbor master. They show full fees paid every time, yet your audit claims otherwise." She gestured, and a servant brought forward a leather case. Thael opened it with shaking hands and pulled out documents, official-looking, with wax seals intact. Marin's mind went ice-cold and razor-sharp. She crossed to Thael and took the documents from his hands before he could protest. Scanned them quickly. They looked legitimate. Ship names, cargo manifests, fee schedules, all showing standard rates paid in full. Except they were wrong. She knew they were wrong because she'd cross-referenced the harbor master's private logs with the treasury deposits, and the discrepancies were undeniable. Unless someone had created a second set of documents, clean ones, backdated and sealed. "These are forgeries," Marin said. "You would say that." Thael's voice cracked. "You've been systematically destroying reputations to cover your own failures. The Duke deserves an heir, and instead of accepting your shortcomings, you're tearing down everyone around you." "Careful, Baron." Marin's voice could have frozen seawater. "You're making this personal when it's purely financial, which makes me wonder what you're really afraid of." "I'm afraid of a bitter woman with access to the treasury and no oversight," Thael was shouting now, his composure completely shattered. "You've had free reign over the books for years. Who's to say you haven't been skimming funds yourself and blaming others to cover your tracks?" The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles shouting questions, merchants demanding answers, Frost's garrison guards moving to strategic positions, hands on weapons, clearly unsure who they were supposed to be protecting from whom. Marin stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her mind working faster than her racing heart. This wasn't just about discrediting her audit anymore. They were trying to paint her as the criminal, desperate, jealous, corrupt. If they could make that stick, everything she'd uncovered would be dismissed as fabrication. And without the evidence, she had nothing. Worse, if they could prove forgery, they could have her arrested, stripped of title, exiled or executed depending on how vindictive Corvin was feeling. Checkmate in 3 moves, except they'd made one mistake. Your Grace, Marin's voice cut through the noise like a blade. I request the right to defend myself. Corvin looked at her with something that might have been pity or exhaustion. Hard to tell. You're accused of falsifying official records. What defense could you possibly— The harbor master. Marin turned to face the crowd. Bring him here, now. Let him verify which set of documents is authentic. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Celine's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. The harbor master is unavailable. Unavailable how? He left Ravenmoor 2 days ago. Family emergency in the eastern provinces. Celine's tone was perfectly sympathetic. Tragic timing, really. Of course he did. Of course they'd gotten rid of the one witness who could verify Marin's claims, probably paid him enough to disappear and keep quiet. Or threatened him. Either way, he was gone, and with him went Marin's most direct proof. Then we'll send for him, Marin said. Bring him back under ducal summons. That could take weeks, Corvin said. Meanwhile, trade is still frozen. Ships are still trapped in port. This situation requires immediate resolution, not prolonged investigation. Translation: he wanted this over. Wanted the conflict gone so he could go back to pretending his duchy wasn't eating itself alive. Marin looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd already made up his mind. He didn't want to believe she was guilty, but he wanted to believe she was innocent even less. Because her innocence meant Celine was guilty, and Corvin had tied himself to Celine in ways that would make disentangling messy and public and humiliating. Better to sacrifice the wife. Cleaner that way. What are you proposing? Marin asked quietly. Corvin shifted in his chair. Wouldn't meet her eyes. Resign your position. Step back from all official duties. Allow an independent audit of the Treasury and harbor records. He paused. If you're cleared, you'll be reinstated with full honors. And if I refuse? Then I'm forced to treat this as what Baron Thale claims it is. Criminal fraud. You'll be detained pending investigation. There it was. The trap closing. Resign quietly and disappear into obscurity, or fight and be arrested for crimes she didn't commit. Marin looked around the hall, saw the nobles calculating which outcome benefited them most, saw the merchants who just wanted trade restored and didn't care who fell to make it happen, saw Celine wearing that stolen ring, barely suppressing her triumph, saw Commander Frost near the door, one hand on her sword, waiting for a signal Marin wasn't sure how to give, and she made a choice. I'll resign, Marin said. The hall relaxed. Nobles nodded. Celine's smile widened. But not yet. The tension snapped back like a broken bowstring. What? Corvin's voice was sharp. You want me to step back from official duties? Fine. But first, I invoke my right as Duchess to address the Council on matters of duchy security. Marin's voice was steady, but her heart was hammering. It's in the original charter. Any member of the ducal family can call an emergency session if they believe the duchy is in immediate danger. This is absurd, Celine said. You can't just— Article 12, Section 4, Marin interrupted. Written by Duke Corvin's grandfather. Never repealed. The session must be granted unless the council votes unanimously to deny it. She looked at Corvin. Your Grace, I'm calling that session. Now. Corvin's jaw worked. He looked at Celine, who'd gone very still, her calculating mind clearly running through the implications. If she pushed to deny the session, it would look like she had something to hide. But if she allowed it, Marin got one last chance to make her case. This is a stalling tactic, Baron Thale said desperately. She's invoking her legal right, Commander Frost said from the doorway. Her voice carried absolute authority. Which means the Duke either grants it or explains to every noble house why he's denying a duchess her charter protections. Corvin closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked like a man trapped between 2 cliffs with the sea rising. 1 hour, he said. Say whatever you need to say. Then we're done with this. Marin nodded once. I'll need access to the tower archives. Why? Because what I'm about to show you isn't in the recent ledgers. She met his eyes. It goes back years, and it's so much worse than missing trade fees. She turned and walked out of the hall before anyone could respond, Frost falling into step beside her. Please tell me you know what you're doing, Frost muttered. I know exactly what I'm doing. Marin's voice was grim. "I'm burning everything down." The tower archives were in the oldest part of the keep, stone rooms that smelled like rot and secrets. Generations of records stacked floor to ceiling, some so old the parchment crumbled at a touch. Most people avoided this place. Too much dust, too much history, too many reminders of failures best forgotten. Marin had been coming here for 3 years. She'd started out of curiosity, then boredom, then because she'd noticed something odd in the recent trade records and wanted to see if it was a new problem or an old pattern. What she'd found had kept her awake at night for months, piecing together a picture so ugly she'd almost convinced herself she was wrong. Almost. Now, with Frost holding a torch and watching the door, Marin pulled down the oldest shipping ledgers, 15 years back, from before she'd married Corvin, when his father was still Duke. "What are we looking for?" Frost asked. "Proof that this corruption isn't new. It's foundational." Marin's hands moved quickly, pulling specific volumes, cross-referencing dates. The reduced fees, the missing revenue, it's been happening since the old Duke's time, maybe longer. So Celine didn't start it. No, but she weaponized it. Marin found the ledger she needed, flipped to the entries she'd marked months ago. Look at this. 15 years ago, Duke Corvin's father renegotiated trade agreements with 6 major families, gave them preferential rates in exchange for political support during a succession crisis. That's not unusual. Alliances need incentives. Agreed, but the preferential rates were supposed to be temporary. 3 years, according to the treaty documents. Marin pulled out another ledger. Except they never ended. They just continued, quietly, without official renewal. And over time, more families got added to the list, always the ones who supported the right causes, opposed the right rivals. Frost was following now, her military mind piecing together the tactical picture. The reduced fees became a loyalty system and a revenue drain. The duchy has been operating at 15% reduced income for over a decade, which means we've been borrowing to cover basic operations, which means we're in debt to... Marin flipped to another section. Several of the same families receiving the reduced fees. They've been lending the duchy money to cover the revenue they're not paying. Frost's voice was flat with disbelief. That's brilliant and devastating. Marin pulled out the final piece, the treasury bonds. We owe them almost 200,000 marks, more than the duchy's annual revenue. If they called in those debts simultaneously, Ravenmore would collapse. Exactly, which means whoever controls those families controls the duchy. Marin looked at Frost. Corvin's father built this system. Corvin maintained it, and Celine figured out how to exploit it. By consolidating the families under her influence. She didn't need to seduce Corvin, she needed to seduce his creditors. Marin's voice was bitter. The ring wasn't about replacing me as wife. It was about replacing me as the obstacle between her and complete financial control. Frost was quiet for a long moment, processing. If you present this to the council, you're not just accusing Celine, you're accusing the old Duke, Corvin, half the noble families in Ravenmore. I know. They'll destroy you. They're already trying. Marin, Frost grabbed her arm. Think about this. If you go public with systemic corruption at this level, you're not fighting Celine anymore. You're fighting the entire power structure that's kept this duchy functioning, barely, for years. They will do anything to silence you. Then they should have let me stay invisible. Marin pulled her arm free gently. I tried playing by their rules, Helena. I tried being quiet and useful and forgettable, and they still came for me. So now we're playing by mine. She gathered the ledgers, the bonds, the treaties, evidence that would implicate everyone and spare no one. Frost helped her carry it all, but her expression was grim. This is suicide. Maybe. But at least it's honest. They made it halfway back to the Great Hall before the attack came. 3 men, dressed like servants, but moving like soldiers. They came out of a side corridor fast, weapons already drawn, short blades meant for close quarters, nothing that would make noise echoing through stone halls. Frost's sword was out before Marin could scream, blocking the first strike in a shower of sparks. The ledgers went flying, parchment scattering across the floor like wounded birds. Run! Frost shouted, driving one attacker back. Marin didn't run. She grabbed the nearest ledger. the treasury bonds, the most damning evidence, and pressed her back against the wall as steel rang against steel. Frost was good, better than good, but she was one woman against 3 trained fighters in a corridor too narrow for proper sword work. One of the attackers broke past her, blade aimed at Marin's throat. Marin threw the only thing she had, the heavy ledger. It hit the man's face with a solid thunk, and he staggered. Not much, but enough for Frost to pivot and drive her blade through his shoulder. He went down screaming. The other 2 pressed harder. Frost was bleeding from a cut on her arm, her breathing harsh. This wasn't a fight she could win. "Guards!" Marin screamed. "Guards to the east corridor! Yore!" One attacker lunged for her, ignoring Frost entirely. Marin grabbed a fallen candelabra, heavy brass, still lit, and swung it like a club. Flames and metal caught the man across the face. He shrieked, stumbling back into his companion. Then running footsteps, shouts. The garrison guards finally responding, flooding into the corridor with weapons drawn. The 2 uninjured attackers ran, just bolted, leaving their wounded companion bleeding on the floor. The guards gave chase, but Marin knew they wouldn't catch them. This was planned, escape routes prepared. Frost leaned against the wall, breathing hard, blood running down her arm. "You all right?" "Fine. You're not." "I've had worse." Frost looked at the wounded attacker who was moaning and clutching his shoulder. "Let's see who sent you." She hauled the man up by his collar. He was young, maybe 20, with the hard face of someone who'd grown up fighting. Not nobility, hired muscle. "Who paid you?" Frost's voice was cold. The man spat blood, said nothing. "Wrong answer." Frost pressed her blade against his throat. "Try again. Wait." Marin knelt, gathering the scattered ledgers with shaking hands. The treasury bonds were intact, but several pages had torn, information bleeding across the floor and ink stains that looked too much like blood. She stood, holding the evidence against her chest like armor, looked at the wounded man with eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "You don't have to tell us who hired you," she said quietly. "We already know. But I need you to understand something. The people who sent you, they're not going to protect you. The moment you become inconvenient, they'll cut you loose. Probably permanently." The man's eyes flickered, fear bleeding through the bravado. "But if you testify, if you tell the council who ordered this attack, I'll make sure you live through it." Marin's voice was steady. "Your choice." The man stared at her, then at Frost, who was still bleeding and still holding a sword to his throat, then at the guards surrounding them, wearing the duchy's colors. He deflated. "Lady Celine Steward, he gave us 50 marks each, said you were a traitor planning to flee with treasury funds, said we'd be heroes for stopping you." "Of course." Framed the assassination as patriotic duty. Brilliant and disgusting. "Take him to the cells," Frost ordered the guards. "And get a healer for his shoulder. He's evidence now." As they dragged the man away, Marin and Frost looked at each other. The commander's face was pale under the blood and grime. "They just tried to kill you," Frost said. "In your own keep. That's not political maneuvering anymore, Marin. That's war." "I know." Marin's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. "Which means we're out of time for subtlety. What are you going to do?" Marin looked down at the ledgers in her arms. Evidence of corruption spanning decades. Proof of a system so rotten it had nearly strangled the duchy it was supposed to sustain. Information that would destroy Celine, implicate Corvin, and probably get Marin killed. But it was the truth. And she was so tired of living in lies. "I'm going to finish what I started," she said. "Come on, council's waiting." They walked back to the great hall, Frost bleeding and Marin carrying documents that felt like they weighed more than stone. The nobles were still there, restless and uncertain, wondering what was taking so long. Celine stood beside Corvin's chair, whispering something in his ear. She looked up when Marin entered, and her expression went from confident to wary in the space of a heartbeat. She saw the blood on Frost's arm, the torn ledgers in Marin's hands, the absolute emptiness in Marin's eyes. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Celine looked genuinely afraid. Marin walked to the center of the hall and set the ledgers down on the council table with a heavy thud that echoed like a judge's gavel. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying to every corner. "Members of the council, I'm ready to present my defense." She looked at Celine, really looked at her, taking in the stolen ring, the borrowed authority, the carefully constructed facade of power. "And when I'm done," Marin said quietly, "everyone in this room is going to understand exactly what's been stolen from this duchy. And who's been doing the stealing?" The hall went silent. Outside, the storm wind screamed against the stones, and inside, Marin opened the first ledger and began to speak. 15 years ago, Marin said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, Duke Corvin's father made a deal with 6 families to secure his position during a succession crisis. Preferential trade rates in exchange for political support. It was supposed to last 3 years. She opened the first ledger, the oldest one, its pages yellow with age. Held it up so the nobles could see the ducal seal, faded but unmistakable. "This is the original treaty. Signed, sealed, witnessed, 3 years of reduced fees, then back to standard rates." She set it down and picked up another ledger. "This is the harbor record from year 4. The reduced rates continued. No new treaty, no official renewal. Just an understanding." Corvin shifted in his chair. His face was unreadable, but Marin saw his knuckles go white where he gripped the armrest. By year 7, 3 more families had been added to the preferential list. By year 10, it was 12 families, all paying roughly half the standard export fees. Marin's finger traced down columns of numbers. The duchy was losing approximately 40,000 marks annually, but no one seemed concerned because the families receiving the discounts were also, she pulled out the bond certificates, lending money to the ducal treasury to cover operational costs. Lady Werner stood up abruptly. "This is absurd. You're twisting legitimate financial arrangements into what exactly?" Marin's eyes were cold. "Please finish that sentence, because from where I'm standing, it looks like a protection scheme. Pay reduced fees, lend the duchy money at interest to cover the shortfall you created, and suddenly you're not just a noble family. You're a creditor with leverage over the Duke himself." The hall erupted, nobles shouting denials, merchants demanding clarification, the sound bouncing off stone walls until it was just noise, just chaos. Marin waited, let them yell. She'd learned something important in 6 years of being ignored. Silence was a weapon if you knew when to use it. Corvin finally raised his hand. It took 3 tries to get quiet. "These are serious accusations, Duchess." His voice was strained. "You're claiming my father." "I'm claiming your father did what he thought necessary to survive a civil war. I'm claiming you inherited a system already broken and kept it running because you didn't know how to fix it." Marin's voice softened slightly. "Not much, but enough. I'm not blaming you for the foundation, Corvin. I'm blaming you for not seeing what was being built on top of it." She turned to face Celine directly. "Because someone did see. Someone very clever realized that controlling those 12 families meant controlling the duchy's debt, and debt is just another word for power." Celine's composure was cracking around the edges. The smile was still there, but it looked painted on now, fragile. "You have no proof I did anything, don't I?" Marin pulled out another document. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Adrenaline had burned through fear and left something harder behind. "This is a loan agreement between the duchy and Baron Thale, signed 8 months ago, right after you arrived. The interest rate is triple the previous agreements." "Economic conditions change," Thale said weakly. "They do. But it's interesting that this new rate was negotiated by someone who isn't even on the financial council." Marin looked at Celine. "You brokered this loan, didn't you? Convinced Thale to lend at higher rates in exchange for, what? Continued preferential treatment? Access to the Duke?" "I facilitated a conversation," Celine said carefully. "Nothing illegal about that." "No, but there is something illegal about this." Marin slammed down another document, and several nobles flinched at the sound. "This is a private contract between you and Lady Werner. She agrees to pay you 10% of her reduced fee savings in exchange for your consulting services, which is just a fancy way of saying you're taking a cut of the money she's stealing from the duchy." Lady Werner's face went gray. "That's a forgery." "Is it?" "Because it has your seal and your signature, and it's dated 2 months ago." Marin's voice was scalpel sharp. "Want to bet I can find similar contracts with every family on the preferential list?" The silence that fell this time was different, heavier, because everyone in the room was doing the same math, reaching the same ugly conclusion. Celine hadn't just been Corvin's mistress. She'd been running a shadow government, collecting tribute from families who thought they were buying influence but were really just funding her consolidation of power. "You're lying," Celine said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You fabricated all of this to what? Frame you for crimes I invented?" Marin laughed, short and bitter. "I'm not that creative, Celine. I'm just thorough. Every document here is real, every signature authentic, every number verified against multiple sources." She gestured to the scattered ledgers. "You want to claim forgery? Fine. Let's bring in independent auditors. Let's send for the harbor master you so conveniently got rid of. Let's put every single one of these families under oath and see who breaks first." Baron Thale made a sound like a wounded animal. Corvin looked like he'd been hit with something heavy. His eyes moved from Marin to Celine to the documents spread across the table, and Marin could see him trying to process it. His mistress, his finances, his entire duchy built on a foundation of organized corruption. "The ring," he said suddenly. "What does the ring have to do with this?" Marin had been waiting for that question. She pulled out one more document, the one she'd found 3 nights ago buried in the oldest archives, the one that had made everything else click into place. The ducal seal ring isn't just symbolic. According to duchy law from 200 years ago, whoever wears it has signatory authority over the treasury in the duke's absence. She held up the ancient charter, its text barely legible. "It's archaic. Most people have forgotten it exists. But legally, if I'm not wearing the ring and someone else is, they can authorize financial transactions," Frost finished from the doorway. She'd gotten her arm bandaged but hadn't left, including loan agreements, bond issues, fee adjustments. The implications hit the room like a physical wave. Celine wearing the ring wasn't just a personal insult, it was a legal maneuver. With Marin discredited and Celine wearing the symbol of Treasury authority, she could have legitimized every corrupt deal, every inflated loan, every stolen mark. And because Corvin had been too distracted or too willfully blind to notice, she'd have had free rein. "You were going to bankrupt the duchy," Marin said quietly. "Weren't you? Push the debt high enough that the families you controlled could call it in simultaneously. Force Corvin to sell off holdings, surrender power, maybe even abdicate. And then what? Marry him yourself when he's got nothing left but a title? Or just install a puppet duke and run things from the shadows?" Celine's mask finally shattered. "You self-righteous bitch!" Her voice was pure venom. "You think you're saving the duchy? You're killing it. These families, they keep the economy running. The loans, the trade, the relationships I've built, without them, Ravenmoor collapses. The duchy was already collapsing. You just wanted to control the fall." "I wanted to fix it." Celine's hands were shaking. "Your husband is weak. You're useless. The old ways are drowning this place in debt and stagnation. I was building something new, something that could actually survive. By stealing from it, by making it efficient." Celine's composure was completely gone now, her voice rising. "The families who paid me understood the value of what they were getting. Protection, access, stability. That's worth more than some arbitrary fee schedule written by a dead man." "You're right," Marin said. "It is." That stopped Celine short. The hall went quiet again. Marin picked up one of the ledgers. Not the old ones, but the current shipping records. "The problem isn't that the families wanted protection or access. The problem is that they were getting it through corruption instead of contribution. You didn't make the duchy efficient, Celine. You made it extractive. The families took more than they gave, and you took a cut of everything they took. That's not governance. That's parasitism." She turned to address the full council. "For 15 years, this duchy has been operating at a deficit. We've been borrowing to fund basic operations while families paid reduced fees and charged us interest on the money we wouldn't need to borrow if they just paid what they owed. It's circular. It's unsustainable. And it was always going to end badly. So what's your solution?" Lord Crane's voice was sharp. "Expose the corruption and tank the entire economy? Those loans are real, Duchess. The debt is real. You can prove Celine's guilty and we'll still be bankrupt." "You're right. We will be. If we keep playing by these rules." Marin pulled out the final document, the one she'd written 3 nights ago when she'd realized the audit wasn't going to be enough. "This is a proposed restructuring of duchy finances. Complete transparency on all trade agreements. Standard fee schedules for everyone. No exceptions. No preferential treatment. Existing loans restructured at fair market rates with extended payment terms. And She looked at the families who'd been paying reduced fees, full restitution of unpaid revenues over the past 5 years. The hall exploded again, this time with genuine panic. That's impossible. Lady Werner was on her feet. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of marks. I'm talking about what you owe. We can't pay that. Then sell holdings, liquidate assets, cut your household staff. Marin's voice was iron. Figure it out. Because the alternative is I present all of this evidence to the Crown and let them decide how to handle systematic fraud against a ducal territory. That shut everyone up. Crown intervention meant investigations, seizures, possible executions. It meant outside control of Ravenmoor for years, maybe decades. It meant the end of everything. Baron Thale looked like he might vomit. You'd destroy us all just to prove you're right? No. Marin's voice softened again. I'd give you a chance to fix what you broke. The restructuring spreads restitution over 10 years. Manageable payments if you actually pay your proper fees going forward. No one has to lose everything, but the corruption ends. Today. All of it. She looked at Corvin. He was staring at the documents like they were written in a language he didn't speak. Your Grace, she said formally, I'm proposing a complete financial reform. Transparent accounting, independent audits, council oversight on all loans and trade agreements. It won't be easy, but it's the only way Ravenmoor survives the next 10 years. Corvin's voice came out hoarse. And Celine? Marin looked at the woman who'd tried to replace her, who'd stolen her ring and her husband's attention, and damn near stolen the entire duchy. Celine stood rigid beside the ducal chair, the ring still on her finger, her beautiful face twisted with rage and fear, and something that might have been desperation. Lady Celine has committed fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud the ducal treasury, Marin said. Each word felt like pulling a knife out of her own chest. She should be arrested, tried, and sentenced according to duchy law. I was trying to save this place, Celine whispered. Everything I did. You were trying to own it, Marin interrupted. There's a difference. Corvin stood slowly. He looked old, tired, like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Guards, he said quietly. Take Lady Celine into custody. Celine's eyes went wide. Corvin, you can't. After everything, he said. I should have been paying attention. To you. To her. To the duchy I'm supposed to be running. His voice was hollow. I'm sorry it came to this. The guards moved forward. Celine backed up, her hand going to the ring on her finger like she might use it as a weapon. For a moment, Marin thought she might actually try to fight. Then Celine's shoulders sagged. She pulled the ring off, slowly, like it hurt, and threw it at Marin's feet. Keep it, she said. It never meant what you thought it did anyway. They led her away. The hall watched in silence. Marin bent and picked up the ring. It was warm from Celine's finger, the gold smooth and heavy in her palm. She stared at it for a long moment, thinking about what it represented. Authority, legitimacy, power. All the things she'd thought she'd lost. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it always had. When she looked up, every eye in the hall was on her. The restructuring proposal, she said, her voice steady despite everything. I need a council vote. Standard protocol. Show of hands. Silence. Then Commander Frost raised her hand. I vote in favor. Lord Pembroke looked at his fellow shipping families, looked at the documents spread across the table, looked at Marin wearing the ring that had been missing for a week. He raised his hand. In favor. One by one, hands went up. Not all of them. Lady Werner kept her arms crossed. Baron Thale looked like he was about to cry. But enough. More than enough. When it was done, Marin had a 2/3 majority. Corvin sat back down heavily. Motion passes. Duchess Marin will oversee the financial restructuring. He paused. And resume all official duties, effective immediately. The formal words, the reinstatement. But his voice was empty, like he was reading from a script he didn't understand. Marin wanted to feel triumphant. She'd won, exposed the corruption, saved the duchy, reclaimed her position. This should have felt like victory. Instead, she just felt tired. Council adjourned, Corvin said. Everyone out. I need... His voice cracked slightly. I need to think. The nobles filed out quickly, whispering among themselves. already calculating how this changed the power structure, who was rising and who was falling. The merchants followed, probably planning how to adjust to the new fee schedules. The servants began cleaning up the scattered documents, moving quietly around the edges of the room. Marin stayed where she was, the ring heavy on her finger. Her evidence still spread across the council table like an accusation that wouldn't go away. Frost approached, her bandaged arm hanging stiffly. "You did it? Did I? You exposed Celine, saved the treasury, reformed the whole corrupt system." Frost's voice was carefully neutral. "That's a win by any measure." "Then why does it feel like I just set fire to my own house?" "Because you did. But it was already burning, you just made it visible." Marin laughed, short and bitter. "Poetic. Useless, but poetic." Corvin cleared his throat. They both turned. He was still sitting in the ducal chair, looking smaller somehow, diminished. "Commander, give us a moment," he said. Frost looked at Marin, who nodded. The commander left, though Marin noticed she didn't go far, just outside the door, where she could hear if things went badly. Corvin and Marin stared at each other across the hall. Husband and wife, Duke and Duchess, strangers who'd once promised to build something together and had instead watched it crumble. "I didn't know," he said finally. "About the loans, the contracts. Most of it. I know. But I should have." His hands twisted together. "I should have been managing the treasury. Should have questioned why revenues were down. Should have—" He stopped. "Should have trusted you instead of Celine." He flinched at the name. "I thought she understood me, listened to me, made me feel like I wasn't constantly failing at this job I never wanted. And I didn't? You made me feel incompetent." His voice was raw. "Every time you managed a crisis I'd ignored, every time you solved a problem I hadn't seen, every time you were just better at this than me. It was like living with a mirror that showed everything I wasn't." Marin felt something crack in her chest. Because she understood. Had spent 6 years trying to be indispensable without being threatening, useful without being superior, and had failed at the impossible balance. "I wasn't trying to diminish you," she said quietly. "I know. But you did anyway." He looked at the ring on her finger. "Did she really steal it? Or did you—" "She stole it. Probably bribed one of my ladies. I'm still figuring out how. And the legal authority thing? The treasury signatory? Real. I found it in the old charters 3 days ago. I don't think Celine knew about it when she took the ring, but she would have figured it out eventually." Corvin closed his eyes. "I'm such a fool." "You're a man who wanted to be loved instead of managed. That's not foolish, just human. Human doesn't keep a duchy running." "No," Marin agreed, "but neither does corruption disguised as efficiency." He opened his eyes, looked at her properly for the first time in months, maybe years. "What happens now?" "Now we implement the reforms, restructure the debt, fix the fee schedules, probably lose half the noble families who decide they'd rather relocate than pay fair taxes." Marin's voice was matter of fact. "It's going to be ugly for a while." "Will you stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Marin thought about the northern territories where she'd grown up, about her mother's advice to keep treasures close and know when to let them go. About 6 years of trying to make a marriage work with a man who'd never wanted her. Not really. She looked at the ring on her finger, symbol of authority, burden of responsibility. "I'll stay," she said, "for the duchy. But Corvin—" She met his eyes. "Don't ask me to pretend this is a partnership. You made your choice when you let Celine wear this ring and said nothing. I can be your duchess. I can't be your wife. Not anymore." He looked like she'd struck him, but he nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I'm not going to be invisible anymore. I'm not going to quietly manage your failures and let you take credit for successes. The reforms go through with my name on them. The trade agreements are negotiated with me at the table. The treasury is under my direct control. You're asking for more authority than most duchesses have. I'm taking the authority I've already been doing the work for." Her voice was steel. "You want a figurehead duchess who smiles and produces heirs and stays out of politics? Find someone else. But you won't. Because after today, every noble house in 5 territories knows what happens when you try to sideline me." Corvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked down from the ducal chair, and stopped in front of her. "I owe you an apology. For Celine." For the neglect. For, he gestured vaguely, everything. Apology noted. Marin, I'm trying to eat. I know what you're trying to do, but I don't need your apology, Corvin. I need your public support. The reforms only work if you back them completely. No wavering when families complain. No exceptions for old friends. No undermining me in council meetings because you're embarrassed your wife knows more about governance than you do. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. You'll have it. In writing, a formal decree granting me full authority over duchy finances and trade policy. That's non-negotiable. Marin's voice was flat. You want to keep Ravenmore from collapsing? This is the price. Your pride or your duchy, choose. The silence stretched. Somewhere outside, the wind had finally died down, the storm passing, leaving wreckage in its wake. Fine, Corvin said. I'll have the decree drafted tonight. I'll draft it. You'll sign it. A muscle jumped in his jaw, but he nodded again. Marin turned to gather her documents, the evidence of everything she'd uncovered and everything it had cost to bring to light. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped sometime during the confrontation, burned away by something harder than fear. Marin. She looked back. Corvin was standing in the middle of the hall, looking lost in his own keep. Do you hate me? He asked quietly. She considered the question, thought about hate and love and the vast gray space between where most marriages actually lived. No, she said honestly. I just don't trust you anymore, and I'm not sure which is worse. She left him there and walked out of the hall, where Frost was waiting with a knowing look and a flask of something that smelled like it could strip paint. Drink? The commander offered. Later. First I need to draft a decree, implement a financial overhaul, and figure out which of my ladies-in-waiting sold me out to Celine. Marin took the flask anyway, took a long swallow that burned all the way down. Then I'll drink. Your priorities are alarming. My priorities are keeping this duchy from imploding. Marin handed back the flask. Everything else is negotiable. They walked through the corridors together, past servants who now looked at Marin with something like respect instead of pity, past nobles who stepped aside and murmured greetings instead of ignoring her. The ring on her finger caught torchlight as she moved, flashing gold with each step. She'd gotten it back. Not through begging or negotiation or quiet acceptance of her diminished status. Through evidence. Strategy. The willingness to burn down everything to expose the rot underneath. It wasn't the victory she'd imagined 6 years ago, when Corvine first placed that ring on her finger and she'd thought she was building a partnership. But it was the victory she'd earned, and for now, that would have to be enough. The decree was on Corvin's desk by dawn. Marin had worked through the night again, this time with a clarity that felt almost dangerous. Every word precise, every clause ironclad. She'd learned enough about duchy law over 6 years to know exactly where the loopholes were and how to seal them. Frost had stayed with her, partially for protection after the assassination attempt, partially because the commander seemed to understand that Marin needed a witness. Someone who could verify she hadn't fabricated this document the way Celine's allies would inevitably claim. You're giving yourself more power than some duchies give their dukes, Frost observed, reading over the final draft. I'm taking the power necessary to fix what's broken. Marin signed her name at the bottom with a flourish that would have made her tutors proud. Corvin can keep the title and the public authority. I just need control over everything that actually matters. Treasury, trade policy, customs enforcement, harbor operations. Frost ticked off the list. You've basically made yourself the duchy's chancellor. Good. Then everyone knows who to blame when this goes badly. She'd carried the decree to Corvin's private study herself, knocked once, and walked in without waiting for permission. He was already awake, or maybe he'd never slept. He looked haggard in the early light, nursing what smelled like his third cup of wine disguised as breakfast. Marin set the decree on his desk without ceremony. Read it, sign it, make it official before the families realize what they agreed to yesterday. Corvin picked up the parchment like it might bite him. His eyes scanned the text, and she watched his expression shift from resignation to disbelief to something that might have been respect or might have been fear. Hard to tell. This is extreme, he said finally. This is necessary. You're essentially removing me from financial governance. I'm removing the opportunity for corruption to hide behind your authority. Marin's voice was flat. You can still make decisions. You just can't make them without oversight, and you can't overturn mine without council approval. So I'm a figurehead. You're a duke who finally has someone he can't charm or ignore doing the work he should have been doing all along. She leaned forward. Sign it, Corvin, or spend the next decade watching Ravenmore drown in debt while you pretend everything's fine. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his quill, dipped it in ink, and signed his name below hers. The scratch of the pen on parchment sounded like a door closing. Marin took the decree, the ink still wet, and left without another word. The real work started immediately. Marin established herself in the Treasury office, the room Corvin hadn't entered in 2 years, and turned it into something between a war room and an accounting house. Ledgers stacked on every surface. Maps of trade routes pinned to walls. A permanent rotation of clerks and auditors processing the backlog of documentation. She started with the shipping families, called them in one by one, laid out exactly what they owed in unpaid fees, and gave them a choice: structured restitution or crown investigation. Most chose restitution. Some tried to negotiate. Lord Pembroke was the first to push back. 10 years is impossible, he said, his normally jovial face drawn tight. You're asking for 12,000 marks. I don't have that kind of capital. Then sell a ship. Marin didn't look up from the calculation she was running. Or renegotiate your trade contracts at higher margins. I don't care how you get the money, Lord Pembroke. I care that you pay what you owe. This will ruin me. No. This will make you honest. She finally looked at him. You've been operating with a 15% cost advantage for 8 years. You've undercut competitors, expanded your fleet, bought that new warehouse in the North District, all on money you essentially stole from the duchy. I'm just asking you to give it back. It wasn't stealing, it was an arrangement. An illegal arrangement that you knew was wrong, or you wouldn't have paid Celine to maintain it. Marin's voice was cold. Don't insult me by pretending this was an oversight. Pembroke's face went red. You're enjoying this. I'm really not. And that was true. There was no pleasure in watching men squirm, even men who'd ignored her for years and deserved the discomfort. But I'm not going to apologize for enforcing the law. He left looking like he'd been physically beaten. Lady Verner was worse. She came in angry, refused to sit, and spent 10 minutes explaining why the entire restructuring was punitive and vindictive and obviously personal. You're punishing us for supporting Celine, she finished. This has nothing to do with finances and everything to do with your wounded pride. Marin let the silence stretch, counted to 5, then spoke. Lady Verner, your family has paid an average of 400 marks per year in export fees, while the standard rate is 800. You've done this for 6 years. That's 2,400 marks in unpaid fees. The restructuring asks for restitution over 10 years, 240 marks annually, which, you'll notice, is still less than what you should have been paying all along. The principle is that you broke the law, and I'm letting you fix it without losing everything. Marin's patience was wearing thin. You can accept the terms, or I can present your private contract with Celine to the Crown and let them decide appropriate punishment for conspiracy to defraud a ducal territory. Your choice. Verner's mouth opened, closed. She looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the angle. This isn't over, she said finally. Yes, it is. You just haven't accepted it yet. But it was Baron Thal's visit that nearly broke Marin's composure. He came in looking destroyed, hadn't shaved, his clothes rumpled. He sat across from Marin and put his head in his hands. I'm ruined, he said, completely. The restitution, the loan restructuring, I can't make the numbers work. Marin pulled out his file. He was right. His debts were deeper than most, his assets more leveraged. The restructuring would squeeze him harder than anyone except maybe Lady Verner. You could liquidate the Southern holdings, she suggested. Those have been in my family for 4 generations. Then you should have thought about that before you paid Celine a percentage of your ill-gotten savings. No sympathy in her voice. She couldn't afford it. Tully looked up, his face haggard. I have children, Duchess. A wife. Staff who depend on those holdings for their livelihood. If I sell, dozens of families lose their homes. And if the duchy collapses from debt, thousands of families lose everything. Marin set down the file. I'm sorry your choices have consequences, Baron, but they're still your choices. I could contest this. Appeal to the Crown. Claim the restructuring is punitive. You could, but the Crown will see the same evidence I presented to the Council, and they're significantly less forgiving about systematic fraud than I'm being. She leaned back. I'm offering you a way to fix this. It won't be easy or comfortable, but it's fair. Take it or leave it. Thalie left looking like a ghost. 3 weeks into implementation, the first real resistance came. 6 families, led by Lady Werner, filed a formal complaint with the Crown, claimed Marin had overstepped her authority, that the restructuring was unconstitutional, that they were being unfairly targeted for political reasons. The complaint arrived via royal courier on a morning when Marin was already running on 3 hours of sleep and too much bad coffee. She read it twice, then threw it across the room. They're appealing to the Crown, she told Frost, who'd become a permanent fixture in the Treasury office, claiming I'm abusing power. Are you? I'm using the authority Corvin legally granted me to enforce laws that have existed for decades. Marin pressed her palms against her eyes. But they'll frame it as a power grab, vengeful wife targeting her husband's supporters. So we need the Crown to see the full picture before Werner spins the narrative. Frost was already tactical, which means sending everything to the Capitol, every ledger, every contract, every piece of evidence. That could take months, and if the Crown sides with the families, then we were already finished, Frost's voice was matter-of-fact. But if we don't fight this, Werner wins by default. The restructuring collapses, the families go back to paying reduced fees, and you become the cautionary tale about what happens when duchesses get ambitious. Marin thought about her mother, about surviving northern winters through patience and preparation, about knowing when to bend and when to break. She picked up the complaint from where it had fallen, read it again, looking for weaknesses. We send everything, she decided. Complete documentation, independent audit results, testimony from the harbor master if we can find him, and we request a royal investigator to review the entire duchy financial system, not just the restructuring. That's bold. If the investigator finds problems you missed, then at least it's honest. Marin was already drafting the response in her head. I'm tired of playing games, Helena. Let the Crown see everything and make their judgment. The response went out that afternoon. Every document, every ledger, every piece of evidence Marin had compiled over months of work. She included a personal letter to the Crown explaining the situation, the systemic corruption, and her proposed reforms. Then she waited. The Crown's investigator arrived 6 weeks later. Lord Chancellor Willem Ashcroft was in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime around his 30th birthday. He came with a team of auditors, legal advisors, and enough authority to shut down the entire duchy if he found sufficient cause. Marin met him in the Great Hall with Corvin beside her. The Duke had been smart enough to realize that United Front was his only play at this point. Your Grace! Your Grace! Ashcroft's bow was perfunctory. I understand Ravenmore has some financial irregularities to discuss. That's an understatement, Marin said. Welcome to the mess. They spent 3 days in the Treasury office. Marin walked Ashcroft through everything. The original preferential agreements, the unauthorized extensions, Celine's extortion network, the restructuring proposal. She held nothing back. Ashcroft listened without expression, asked questions that cut straight to the heart of legal complexities, made notes in a leather journal that never left his sight. On the 4th day, he requested a private meeting with Marin, alone. They sat in the library, rain beating against the windows, the smell of old books and older secrets heavy in the air. You've put me in a difficult position, Duchess, Ashcroft said. Marin's stomach dropped. How so? The families that filed the complaint. They're not wrong that your restructuring is aggressive. It does concentrate significant power in your hands. And there is precedent for the Crown being wary of duchesses who accumulate too much independent authority. But? Because there had to be a but. Otherwise, he'd have just shut her down already. But the corruption you've exposed is genuine and systemic. The evidence is overwhelming. And your proposed reforms, while aggressive, are also the only viable path to solvency I can see. He closed his journal. The Crown could overrule you, force a more moderate approach. But moderate approaches don't fix structural rot. They just slow the decay. So what's your recommendation? Ashcroft was quiet for a moment, studying her with those sharp eyes. How old are you, Duchess? 26. And you've been managing Ravenmore's actual governance for how long? 6 years since I married Corvin. While he did what, exactly? Marin chose her words carefully. The Duke has many responsibilities, public duties, political relationships, military oversight. Translation: you've been running the duchy while he played at being Duke. Ashcroft's voice was dry. I've read the records, Duchess. I know which policies worked and which failed. I know who drafted the successful trade agreements and who signed them. The pattern is illuminating. I'm not trying to undermine my husband. I know. You're trying to save his duchy despite his incompetence, which is either admirable or foolish, and I haven't decided which. He leaned forward. Here's what I'm going to recommend to the Crown. The restructuring stands. The families pay restitution. You maintain financial authority, but he raised a hand before she could react. You'll accept Crown oversight, quarterly audits, annual reviews, transparency requirements that make it impossible for you to build your own corruption network. I wasn't planning to. Everyone says that. The oversight isn't about you personally. It's about the system. No one person should have this much financial control without checks. His expression softened slightly. But between you and me, I think you're exactly what Ravenmore needs, someone who understands the work and isn't afraid to do it. Marin felt something unclench in her chest. So the families lose their appeal? Spectacularly. I'll be recommending additional penalties for those who knowingly participated in the extortion scheme. They tried to use the Crown as a weapon against reform. That doesn't sit well with His Majesty. And Celine? The conspiracy charges stand. She'll be tried, likely convicted, and exiled at minimum. Possibly worse, depending on how vindictive the Duke wants to be. Ashcroft stood. One more thing. The ring situation. What about it? The ancient law about Treasury signatory authority, that's problematic. It's a legal oddity that could be exploited. I'm recommending it be formally repealed and replaced with clear protocols for financial authority that don't depend on symbolic jewelry. Marin twisted the ring on her finger. That makes sense. Keep it, though. You earned it back. That means something. After he left, Marin sat alone in the library for a long time, watching rain streak down the windows. She'd won. Actually won. The Crown was backing her reforms. The families would pay restitution. The corruption would end. So why did she still feel hollow? The answer came that evening when Corvin found her in the Treasury office. Ashcroft gave me his preliminary findings, he said without preamble. Congratulations, you were right about everything. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not. He trailed off, standing awkwardly in the doorway like a visitor in his own keep. Can we talk? Marin gestured to the chair across from her desk. Corvin sat, looking uncomfortable in a way that might have been funny if it wasn't so sad. The Crown investigator asked me a lot of questions about duchy management, he said, about who makes which decisions, who drafted which policies. He made it very clear he knew you've been doing most of the actual governing. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I know, but I'm embarrassed anyway. He looked at his hands. I was raised to be Duke, tutored in history, law, military strategy. I was supposed to be good at this, and instead, I've been decorative while you did the real work. You weren't decorative. You handled diplomatic relationships, public ceremonies, military oversight with Frost. Helena makes the actual tactical decisions. I just sign off on them. His voice was bitter. I'm a figurehead in my own duchy, Marin. And the worst part is everyone knows it now. The Crown, the families, the servants. Everyone knows the Duchess actually runs Ravenmore. Marin set down her pen. What do you want me to say, Corvin? I'm sorry I was competent? Sorry I kept things running while you were distracted? I want you to understand why I... He stopped, started over. Celine made me feel capable, like I was actually leading instead of following your scripts. It was a lie, obviously, but it felt good. And I made you feel incompetent. You made me feel unnecessary. The honesty in his voice was raw. Every successful policy had your fingerprints. Every crisis you solved before I knew it existed. I'm the Duke, but you're the one people respect. That's hard to live with. Marin thought about the past 6 years, about making herself small and useful and non-threatening and still somehow ending up here. about the impossible balance between competence and deference that women were supposed to maintain. "I can't apologize for being good at this," she said quietly. "I won't. If you needed someone less capable to feel better about yourself, you married the wrong person." "I know." Corvin's shoulders sagged. "I know, and I'm sorry. For Celine. For not backing you earlier. For being exactly the kind of weak leader my father was terrified I'd become. Your father built the corrupt system I just dismantled. Maybe you're better than him and just don't realize it yet. Or maybe I'm exactly him, just with a more competent wife to hide my failures." He stood. "Ashcroft asked if I wanted to contest your authority, suggested the crown could restructure governance to be more traditional." Marin's blood went cold. "And?" I told him no, that you have full ducal backing, that the reforms are joint policy, and any attempt to undermine you undermines me. He met her eyes. "I may be a mediocre duke, Marin, but I'm not suicidal. This duchy needs you more than it needs my pride." "That's very politically wise." Helena helped me phrase it, a ghost of a smile. "Apparently even my good decisions require management." After he left, Marin sat in the silence of the Treasury office and let herself feel it. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the weight of everything that had happened and everything still to come. The door opened quietly. Frost leaned in. "You should eat something. You've been in here for 16 hours. "I'm fine." "You're not. But you're also not going to admit it, so I brought food anyway." Frost set down a tray. Bread, cheese, some kind of stew that smelled better than anything Marin had eaten in weeks. They ate in comfortable silence, two women who'd somehow become allies in the middle of a political war neither had wanted. "What happens next?" Frost asked. "The families pay restitution. The trade system gets reformed. Quarterly crown audits make sure I'm not becoming what I just destroyed." Marin broke off a piece of bread. "And I run this duchy while Corvin plays duke, and we pretend it's a partnership. That's not sustainable long-term. Nothing about this is sustainable long-term. But it's what we have. You could leave. You've proven yourself. The crown would back you if you wanted an annulment. You could return to your family holdings, manage them, live quietly." Marin considered it, truly considered it. The Northern Territories, her mother's lands, a life without politics or corruption or husbands who resented her competence. It sounded peaceful, empty. "And let everything I built collapse the moment I'm gone?" She shook her head. "No. Ravenmore needs someone who actually cares about it surviving. That's apparently me now. That's the most depressing answer to 'what are your life goals' I've ever heard. Welcome to Duchess life." The final piece fell into place 3 months later. The families had begun paying restitution. Ships were moving again, trade flowing, revenues increasing for the first time in years. The Crown's first quarterly audit had come back clean, which was apparently shocking enough that Ashcroft sent a personal note of congratulations. And Celine's trial had concluded. Marin hadn't attended. Couldn't stomach watching the woman who'd nearly destroyed everything plead for mercy she didn't deserve. But she read the verdict when it came. Guilty on all counts. 10 years exile. All assets seized to partially cover the duchy's losses. It should have felt like closure. Instead, Marin stood in her chambers the night the verdict was announced and stared at the ring on her finger. The symbol she'd fought so hard to reclaim. The authority she'd nearly died defending. It felt heavier than it should. She was still standing there when someone knocked. "Come in." Lady Ashford entered hesitantly. Catherine, who'd warned her about Celine's meeting, who'd been one of the only genuine friends Marin had in this nest of vipers. "I wanted to thank you," Ashford said, "for the reforms. My husband's shipping business was struggling against the families with preferential rates. Now, we're actually competitive again. I didn't do it for you specifically. I know. You did it because it was right, which is somehow more impressive." She paused. "The ladies are talking. About you. About what you accomplished. I'm sure they have opinions. They're calling you the Iron Duchess." Ashford smiled slightly. "Not to your face, obviously, but it's respectful. Afraid, but respectful." Marin laughed despite herself. "Iron Duchess, like I'm some kind of warrior queen instead of an accountant who got angry. You're the woman who dismantled a corruption network, survived an assassination attempt, and restructured an entire duchy's finances while most people were sleeping. That's more than accounting." After Ashford left, Marin walked to the window. Outside, the harbor was alive with activity. Ships loading cargo, sailors working the docks, the machinery of commerce turning the way it should, openly, legally, fairly. She'd done that. Marin, not the Duke, not the Council. One woman who'd refused to stay invisible when everyone wanted her gone. The ring caught moonlight on her finger. She thought about taking it off, putting it away somewhere safe. It had caused so much pain, represented so much conflict. But that wasn't what it meant anymore. Now, it meant she'd fought for her place and won. Meant she'd burned down corruption and built something better from the ashes. Meant she'd proven that power wasn't about birth or beauty or who you charmed. It was about competence, courage, and the willingness to do what was right even when it cost everything. Marin left the ring on. The next morning, she called a council meeting. Full attendance required. The nobles filed in looking wary. They still weren't sure whether to fear her or respect her, probably both. Corvin sat in the ducal chair wearing his ceremonial robes, looking every inch the proper duke. But when Marin stood to address the council, everyone's attention shifted to her. "I'm implementing additional reforms," she announced without preamble. "Transparent publication of all trade agreements, public posting of fee schedules, monthly financial reports available for any citizen to review." Murmurs of surprise. Someone, probably Lord Crane, muttered something about radical transparency. "The corruption happened because it was hidden," Marin continued. "No more shadows. If the duchy's finances can't withstand public scrutiny, they shouldn't exist. This is unprecedented," Lady Verner said. She'd lost her appeal to the crown and was paying restitution, but still held her council seat. "You're making internal duchy operations public knowledge. I'm making them accountable. There's a difference." Marin's voice was steel. "Anyone opposed can vote against the measure, but know that the crown has already approved it as part of ongoing oversight. No one voted against it." After the meeting, Frost caught up with her in the corridor. "You're really going to publish everything? Even the embarrassing parts?" "Especially the embarrassing parts. That's how we prove this is different." Marin looked at her friend. "People need to believe the system actually changed, not just the players. You're either brilliant or insane. History will decide which." 6 months after the ring disappeared, Marin stood in the Great Hall addressing a gathering of merchants, ship captains, and trade guild representatives. Not nobles, workers. The people who actually made the economy function. She'd called the meeting herself over Corvin's objections to explain the new trade policies directly to those affected. "The preferential rate system is permanently abolished," she told them. "Everyone pays the same fees based on cargo volume and value. No exceptions, no special arrangements, no bribes." A ship captain raised his hand. "What about families with long-standing agreements? They pay standard rates like everyone else. Some will complain. Let them." Marin's voice carried to the back of the hall. "This duchy runs on trade. That means the people who do the work deserve a system they can trust. You shouldn't have to cultivate noble friendships to get fair treatment." "And if the nobles try to bring back the old system?" someone called out. "Then you report it directly to me. The Treasury Office receives complaints every day at midday. Anyone who tries to reinstate corruption will be investigated and prosecuted." She paused. "I'm not naive. I know people will try, but they'll fail, because you're watching now, and so is the crown." The gathering dispersed with more hope than cynicism. Small victory, but it counted. That evening, Marin found herself back in the tower overlooking the harbor. The same place she'd stood the night Celine wore the ring in triumph. The night everything changed. Frost joined her without asking, carrying that same flask of paint-stripping liquor. "To the Iron Duchess," the commander said, offering the flask. Marin took it, drank. "I hate that nickname." "Too late. It's stuck." Frost grinned. "You're a legend now. The woman who brought down the corrupt system and lived to tell about it." "I didn't bring it down. I just exposed it. The system brought itself down by being unsustainable." Poetic revision of history. I like it. They stood together watching the ships, the commerce, the life of a duchy that was slowly, painfully healing. "Do you regret it?" Frost asked quietly. "Everything you sacrificed?" Marin thought about it. Her marriage, dead in all but name, her privacy, gone under crown oversight, her peace, shattered by the responsibility she'd claimed. The simple life she could have had if she'd just stayed quiet and let the corruption continue. No, she said honestly. I regret that it was necessary. But not that I did it. What happens when Corvin dies? When you're no longer Duchess? Then whoever comes next inherits a duchy with transparent finances and accountable governance, and they'll have to work a lot harder to break it than I did to fix it. Long-term thinking, very northern of you. My mother taught me that. Marin smiled slightly. Build things that outlast you. Everything else is just ego. The wind picked up, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Marin turned the ring on her finger, not nervously anymore, just thoughtfully. It had been stolen, weaponized, used to humiliate her, and she'd taken it back not through force or pleading, but through proof, through patience, through the kind of determined competence that couldn't be denied or dismissed. The ring was back where it belonged, not because someone gave it to her, because she'd earned the right to wear it. In the end, that was what mattered. Not love or legitimacy granted by others, not approval or acceptance. Just the quiet certainty that she'd done the work, survived the war, and built something worth protecting. Ravenmore would endure. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. And Marin would make sure of it. She took one last drink from Frost's flask, then handed it back. Come on, she said. We have about 6 more hours of work before sleep looks possible. You know, most people would celebrate their victory, take a day off, enjoy the win. Most people didn't just restructure an entire duchy's economy while everyone tried to kill them. Marin started walking back toward the keep. Besides, celebration implies the work is done. It's barely started. But as they walked through the corridors, past servants who nodded respectfully, past nobles who stepped aside, past the physical evidence that things had fundamentally changed, Marin felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not happiness, exactly, but purpose. The bone-deep knowledge that she was doing what she was meant to do, in the place she was meant to be, regardless of the cost. The ring caught torchlight as she moved, flashing gold against the stone walls. A symbol reclaimed, an authority earned, a war won not through violence but through the unglamorous, exhausting, absolutely essential work of making a broken system whole. In a land ruled by tides and storms, Marin had proven one truth that would echo long after she was gone. Power wasn't worn like jewelry or granted like favors. It was wielded, carefully, competently, without apology. And anyone who forgot that lesson would answer to the Iron Duchess herself.